Hello everyone. My name is John Sierra and I'm a Tolkien scholar, and what that essentially means is that I'm the kind of guy that you can come to with any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. If you have a question about The Hobbit, if you have a question about The Lord of the Rings, if you have a question about the Silmarillion, or if you have a question about any of his other stories, his life, his translations, his academic work, I'm the guy that you can come to and ask that question, and I will come back to you with an informed answer, possibly after some research. Just to give you a little bit of background, I've been studying Tolkien for decades, ever since I was very young. Let's see, I read The Lord of the Rings. Well, I read The Hobbit when I was 8 years old. I read The Lord of the Rings when I was around 11 or 12 years old. And then, shortly after that, when I was a teenager, I read Unfinished Tales, and that's when I really started to have this fascination, because it was starting to go into the deeper lore, even deeper than the appendix of The Lord of the Rings, and that's when I started to seek out his other works and start to really study them. And, I'm going to be 45 this year, so it's been quite the long journey. That being said, welcome to the channel. I'm going to ask you to like the video. I'm going to ask you to leave a comment on the video. I'm going to ask you to subscribe because it really helps me out, and I'll ask again at the end of the video in case you're sort of on the fence about that. The format is pretty simple. We're going to start with, of course, I just did my intro. I'm going to explain how you can ask questions. I'm going to do a reading for you. We're going to get through all the questions that I've chosen to be in a video this week, and then we're going to review the quizzes that I've posted on my YouTube channel and see how people did and make my comments on those. So if you want to ask a question, of course, you can ask a question of me anywhere. People ask questions in the comments section. They've even come by my live streams and they've asked questions there. And we are live on this channel most Thursdays. Not every Thursday, but most Thursdays we're live on this channel doing Tolkien-related content, including readings and playing Tolkien-related video games, and also a podcast I do with two other Tolkien scholars, Matt Richardson and Sid Kemp. But if you want to be featured in a video, what you could do is, there's two ways to go about it. One is to use a website called Quora. So Quora is a knowledge-sharing platform where you can ask any sort of question and have people answer it who have the relevant knowledge or experience or expertise or wisdom. And if you ask any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien on there, you can tag me in that. There's a link to my Quora account in the description of this very video, as well as a link to my Quora space, The Grey Havens. And if you ask a question on there about Tolkien, it's going to recommend you tag me and a few other people as well. There's a list that you'll get. My name will be out near the top of the list. Another way that you could do it is through the YouTube community feature, which only works on mobile, really. So there's a little video that'll pop up that shows you how it works on the YouTube mobile app. You just go to my channel and then you click join the community, and you can make a post there. And any question you ask there will be considered a question that I will answer in a video instead of replying directly to you. If you do it that way, please try to keep it to one question per post. That way I can sort of, answer a question and sort of mark that off as done. The reason that I say that is because sometimes I'll get a few questions and I'll be like, well, this one I can answer right away, but this one needs some research and this one I need to think about for a while, so I'll sit on some for a while, So if you don't get an answer from me, there might be a few reasons. One is I might be planning to answer your question and I'm still doing research, or I might have very recently answered it, and so when somebody else asked, so I don't feel like repeating myself so soon. Or it might be just sort of the sort of question that I really need to think about for a while and ruminate on how I'm going to sort of attack the problem. Anyway, I wanted to read a bit about Númenor today. So I have what here is definitely the definitive book on Númenor. It's called The Fall of Númenor and Other Tales from the Second Age, and this came out just a few years ago, really. It's the most recent Tolkien book to have been published. Most of the stuff in here was published previously, but this is a really wonderful volume to get the entire tale of everything having to do with Númenor and the entire Second Age, all in a chronological fashion. And one question that I get a lot is specifically about Sauron being brought to Númenor as a prisoner, but then seducing the king and becoming high in his councils. And of course, The account of this in the Silmarillion is rather brief, because that's how the Silmarillion is written. But we have a deeper look into it here, so I'm going to read you a bit from this chapter. From the Second Age, 3262, Sauron is taken as prisoner to Númenor. 3262 to 3310, Sauron seduces the king and corrupts the Númenorians. I'm going to read you a bit of this so you can just see a little bit more of how he went about corrupting the king. So here we go. Hoping to accomplish by cunning what he could not achieve by force, Sauron passed over the sea and looked upon the land of Númenor, and on the city of Armenelos in the days of glory, and he was astounded, but his heart was filled with more than envy. Let's try that again. But his heart was within was filled the more with envy and hate. Yet such was the cunning of his mind and mouth, and the strength of his hidden will, that ere 3 years had passed he had become the closest to the secret counsels of the king. For flattery, sweet as honey, was ever on his tongue, and knowledge he had of many things yet unrevealed to men. Now Sauron had great wisdom and knowledge, and could find words of seeming reason for the persuasion of all but the most wary, and he could still assume a fair countenance when he wished. Great kings must have their will, this was the burden of all his advice, and whatever the king desired, he said, was his right, and devised plans whereby he might gain it. And seeing the favour that he had of their lord, all the counsellors began to fawn upon him, save one alone, Amandil, lord of Adunia. Then slowly a change came over the land, and the hearts of the elf friends were sorely troubled, and many fell away out of fear. And although those that remained still called themselves the faithful, their enemies named them rebels. For now, having the ears of men, Sauron with many arguments gainsaid all that the Valar had taught, and he bade men think that in the world, in the east and even in the west, there lay yet many seas and many lands for their winning, wherein was wealth uncounted. And still, if they should at last come to the end of those lands and seas, beyond all lay the ancient darkness. And out of it the world was made, for darkness alone is worshipful, and the Lord thereof may yet make other worlds to be gifts for those that serve him, so that the increase of their power shall find no end. And Ar-Pharazôn said, Who is the Lord of the darkness? Then behind locked doors Sauron spoke to the king, and he lied, saying, It is he whose name is not now spoken, for the Valar have deceived you concerning him, putting forward the name of Eru, a phantom, devised in the folly of their hearts, seeking to enchain men in servitude to themselves. For they are the oracle of this Eru, which speaks only that they will, but he is their master yet shall prevail. And he will deliver you from this phantom, and his name is Melkor, Lord of all, giver of freedom, and he shall make you stronger than they. Then Ar-Pharazôn the king turned back to the worship of the dark and of Melkor, the lord thereof, at first in secret, but ere long openly and in the face of his people. And they made, for the most part, followed him. Yet there dwelt still a remnant of the faithful, as had been told, at Romena and in the country near. And other few there were here and there in the land. The chief among them, to whom they looked for leading courage in evil days, was Amandil, counsellor of the king, and his son Elendil, whose sons were Isildur and Anarion, then young men by the reckoning of Númenor. Amandil and Elendil were great ship captains, and they were of the line of Elros Tar Minyatur, though not of the ruling house to whom belonged the crown and the throne in the city of Armenelos. In the days of their youth together Amandil had been dear to Pharazôn, and though he was of the elf friends, he remained in his council until the coming of Sauron. Now he was dismissed, for Sauron hated him above all others in Númenor. But he was so noble, and had been so mighty a captain of the sea, that he was still held in honour by many of the people, and neither the king nor Sauron dared to lay hands on him as yet. Therefore Amandil withdrew to Romena, and all that he trusted still to be faithful he summoned to come thither in secret, for he feared that evil would now grow apace. and all the elf friends were in peril. And so it soon came to pass, for the Meneltarma was utterly deserted in those days. And though not even Sauron dared to defile the high place, yet the king would let no man upon pain of death ascend to it, not even those of the faithful who kept Iluvatar in their hearts. And Sauron urged the king to cut down the white tree Nimloth the Fair that grew in his courts, for it was a memorial to the Eldar and of the light of Valinor. At first the king would not assent to this, since he believed that the fortunes of his house were bound up with the tree, as was forspoken by Tar Palantir. Thus, in his folly, he who had now hated the Eldar and the Valar vainly clung to the shadow of the old allegiance of Númenor. But when Amandil heard rumour of the evil purpose of Sauron, he was grieved to the heart, knowing that in the end Sauron would surely have his will. Then he spoke to Elendil and the sons of Elendil, recalling the tale of the trees of Valinor, and Isildur said no word, but went out by night and did a deed, for which he was afterwards renowned. For he passed alone in darkness to Amenelos and to the courts of the king, which were now forbidden to the faithful. And he came to the place of the tree, which was forbidden to all by the orders of Sauron, and the tree was watched day and night by guards in his service. At that time Nimloth was dark and bore no bloom, for it was late in the autumn, and its winter was nigh. And Isildur passed through the guards, and took from the tree a fruit that hung upon it, and turned to go. But the guard was aroused, and he was assailed, and fought his way out, receiving many wounds. And he escaped, and because he was disguised, it was not discovered who had laid hands on the tree. But Isildur came at last hardly back to Rowmena, and delivered the fruit to the hands of Amandil ere his strength failed him. Then the fruit was planted in secret, and it was blessed by Amandil. And a shoot arose from it and sprouted in the spring. But when its first leaf opened, then Isildur, who had lain long and come near to death, arose and was troubled no more by his wounds. So, you can see, I highly recommend this book, really. If you haven't gotten The Fall of Númenor, which is brilliantly edited by Brian Sibley, I highly recommend you get it. You get so much more detail, and like I said, a lot of this stuff actually had previously been published. It's just that it was across a lot of different things. Like, some of it is the Silmarillion, some of it's Unfinished Tales, some of it's only in the history of Middle-earth, some of it was in Vinyar Tengwar or Parma Eldalamberan, or all these other sources, and some of it is actually new. It's just really interesting to get all these different stories all told in a chronological fashion, And because of the unfinished nature of Tolkien's work, there are some sections that are very, very brief, like about the death of Anarion, It's just ever so slightly a little bit more than what we got in, The Lord of the Rings, but, just still like just a page, really. Just really 2 paragraphs, actually. What was interesting there is you get to hear a little bit, you get to see the actual dialogue between Sauron and Pharazôn, and how he tells him, hey, there's lands that you haven't been to, there's this vastness beyond even the west, and all these lands with all these great treasure that you could claim, and you could just become, just rich beyond your wildest measure. And then if you come to the end of the land, you'll come to the darkness and the king of the darkness. And I know the Valar told you that it was God, but it's actually Melkor, and the God that they created is just made up just to sort of keep you in line, and he just basically destroys their whole religion and sets them on a path of basically devil worship, and even Pharazôn, who's now worshipping the devil, even he, felt a little bit of, well, maybe this isn't, the best thing to be doing, and was doing it in secret, but then eventually started doing it openly. Pharazôn was always this sort of guy who would get like just a little inkling of, wait a minute, this isn't right. But then his pride would win out, and we see that, at his fall when he comes to the Undying Lands and he passes by Tol Eressëa and he sees, I almost said Meneltarma, that's the mountain on Númenor, the Tanaquetil, the highest peak in the whole of the world, and upon which, is Manwe and Varda, the king and queen of the world, and he had a thought, maybe I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing. maybe I should turn back. Of course, it was sort of already too late, and just the fact that Sauron was able to kind of easily, just within 3 years, just turn them completely topsy-turvy, pretty much proved that they were sort of already a fallen people. And there are earlier parts in the book that detail that, about how they had come to Middle-earth and they had conquered places in Middle-earth and they had enslaved people because they thought that they had the right to do so. They thought they were, hey, we live longer, we're sort of like the chosen people, we can just sort of do whatever we want, and the people in Middle-earth are just going to have to accept us as their overlords. So they were already on a really bad path. Sauron just sort of hastened it. And you get a lot about Isildur there. We know that he had, taken a sapling of Nimloth and brought it to Middle-earth, and that's how we get, the white tree in Gondor, which of course does die, and then there's another sapling that is discovered at the end of The Lord of the Rings by, Gandalf and Aragorn. That is, actually blooming, which is sort of the planet Arda itself, recognizing that Aragorn is the king. But here we get this, great detail of that he had to sneak in, and that he was caught, and that he was wounded, and he was almost dying, and then when the little sapling bloomed, he suddenly was healed, and, you sort of get like the sort of idea that, that it was already in place, that the line of kings was very tied into the trees. Pharazon's a false king. Pharazon wasn't supposed to be the king of Númenor. Tarmiriel was supposed to be the queen, and he forced her hand in marriage and took the scepter by force, pretty much. So, he's sort of not supposed to be the king at all, But anyway, we have 10 questions to get to, so we're going to get started with that. So let's move on to your first question. Our first question comes in by the request of, Norma was the name on Quora, but I know this is actually Time Lord Boy on YouTube, so I'm going to say Time Lord Boy whenever I see this name, so because I always have to allude to sort of the lewd pun there, which is not really even that bad, it's just not something I'm going to say on YouTube. Here it is. In the early draft of the Fall of Gondolin, it says Meglin was half-orc. Is there any other characters in The Lord of the Rings who are half-orc, and is there much evidence for it being an actual thing? So before we speak specifically on Meglin, there are absolutely half-orcs, and there are also Uruk-hai. The difference between the half-orcs and the Uruk-hai is that the half-orcs mostly look like men, where the Uruk-hai mostly look like Uruks, like goblins. So you could say that half-orcs are sort of men that have some orcish blood in them, whereas the Uruk-hai are orcs that have some mannish blood in them. And it was said specifically that some of the nastier folk in Bree and some of the rough men that had invaded the Shire were half-orcs, But anyway, let's speak about Meglin. It simply doesn't say in the text that Meglin is half-orc. In this case, you might have fallen into what I would refer to as the RPG trap. The character that we know from the Silmarillion known as Meglin was called Meglin in the primitive Fall of Gondolin. It just didn't have an A in it. And you could read this in the Book of Lost Tales Part 2. Meglin's parentage is actually pretty easily laid out. He's the son of Isfin and Eal. Now, the character Isfin, his mother was later renamed in the Silmarillion. They called her Arathel, which is just a better name. He belongs to the House of the Mole, which is one of the 12 great houses of Gondolin. Now, let me describe this whole RPG trap thing to you. Now, if you've ever played an RPG, a role-playing game, particularly the video game type, although it's not exclusive to that, it happens in the tabletop type as well. One of the ways that you would gather information that you need is to speak with people and hear rumors. The old trope of going to the tavern and listening to rumors. And rumors are always true in most cases because these non-player characters pretty much exist just to serve the player this information. They don't have their own lives and backstories and personalities. They're just there to pass on information that is going to lead the players to their next goal. And this has become such an axiom that when it goes awry, when there's an NPC in one of these games and that tells a rumor and it doesn't pan out, it's not actually true. It's either seen as, well, that was a mistake, or they tricked us, or maybe they were just doing a version of a trope. In literature, characters don't exist to serve information to any particular character. They exist to serve information to the reader. And the reader is not part of the story, thus there is information that can be false. So saying that Meglin is half-orc is just as true as saying that Bilbo Baggins had vast hoards of treasure hidden in his walls, or that Rohan was paying tribute to Gondor by giving them horses every year. These are things that characters in the book said, but they're just untrue. Bilbo has a moderate amount of treasure, a chest of silver and a chest of gold, which is by his standards, a lot of money. And he also had half a chest of troll treasure. The characters that exist in the Shire, they have these very active imaginations, and because of Bilbo's very generous with his wealth, and he's sort of this eccentric guy, the rumor mill just exaggerates how much money he actually has. So they just think that there's these tunnels in his house and behind his walls that are just filled to the brim with treasure. And there's even a scene where Bilbo's like, well, that's ridiculous, And, the thing with Gwe here reports a rumor to Gandalf that Rohan pays a yearly tribute to Mordor in horses. And we later find out that there's really no truth to that. Mordor attempted to buy horses from Rohan, and they were turned down, and then they just stole them. Many vile things are said about Galadriel that just aren't true, and Éomer, he realizes pretty quickly that repeating these rumors that he's heard can be dangerous to his well-being, and he winds up apologizing. So, regarding Meglin having a bit of orc ancestry in him, the Book of Lost Tales even just straight up tells you that it's not true, that it can't possibly be true. So I'm going to read the passage here. Now the sign of Meglin was a sable mole, and he was great among quarrymen and a chief of the delvers after ore, and many of those belonged to his house. Less fair was he than most of this goodly folk, swart, and of none too kindly mood, so that he won small love, and whispers there were that he had orc's blood in his veins, but I know not how this could be true. So, due to the fact that he's just not as handsome as your typical gnome, and that he's kind of a nasty person, he has a foul mood about him. There's rumors in Gondolin that he's part orc, and this is sort of spread around. And even the narrator, and the narrator in Book of Lost Tales is a character in the Legendarium. He has to say, wait, no, that's not true. And this is sort of similar to the narrator in The Hobbit, which is Bilbo, pointing out that the Shire rumor that one of the Took ancestors married a fairy was something that Bilbo considered to be hogwash. So, so what I'm getting at is that in the primitive Fall of Gondolin, it doesn't say that Meglin had orc ancestry. It said that there was a rumor that he had orc ancestry, and that's pretty much an impossibility. All right, let's move on to the next question. Here we have a question submitted to me by Ace Gang, who asks, was the first kinslaying committed by Feanor the first time there was a battle not fought by the Maya in Valinor or Middle-earth? Probably not, no. And you said Maya, you probably just meant like more Ainur, because the Valar fought in battles as well. But probably not. Keep in mind that we are not privy to every single conflict in Tolkien's world, just the ones that one of the focal characters are present at, or one of the focal characters is told about. In the case of the kinslaying at Alqualanda, it was not the first time that elves fought. It was not even the first time that they fought in the Undying Lands, because Finwë fought against Melkor a bit earlier. But of course, that does involve one of the Ainur. But we have to take into account, what is the reason that the elves are in the Undying Lands at all? They're not indigenous to Aemon. They're indigenous to Middle-earth. And they were invited to the Undying Lands when the Ainur decided to depart and go to the Undying Lands. So the reason that they were departing, overall it's Melkor. But then you may take, But he was captured. He was brought to Mandos. So why were the Valar just so worried and trying to get all the elves to leave Middle-earth? They really shouldn't have been doing that, especially because it was very short-sighted to expect all of the elves to leave and then just have the second-born mortal men essentially fend for themselves. But, men were not yet awakened in the world, though the time was very soon. And at least there were elves still in Middle-earth. There were the Avari, the Sindar. They were there to do what elves were supposed to do and assist men. Melkor was taken from Middle-earth, but there were plenty of things left behind to cause battles. Orcs are the major thing here. Orcs came about almost as quickly as the elves awoke, and there were, Balrogs and Saurons over there as well in the wide world. So orcs, they don't keep to themselves usually, and even when they aren't, actively making war, they're bandits, they're highwaymen. They attack people. They're either killing you and taking your food and your riches for their own, or they're going to take you as a slave to create things for them, like to create food for them or whatever they need that they don't want to do themselves. Considering that the existence of orcs predates the elves going to the west, so there had to have been battles fought between elves and orcs in Middle-earth before the kinslayings ever happened. All right, let's move on to the next question. Here's another question submitted by Time Lord Boy, who asks, could Melian have spent eternity with Thingol in the halls of Mandos? Well, she could have, but there's no reason to believe that she would need to spend an eternity there. Elves don't sit in Mandos for eternity unless they've done something very wrong, like Feanor, or they chose to stay there for some reason, like Finwë. There's no doubt that Thingol, upon being killed, he would of course wind up in Mandos, but it would be temporary. For an elf to get released from Mandos, there's two conditions that need to be met. The first one is that their original body, the one that died, must wither away completely to nothing. And this is said to happen very fast in Middle-earth, which is where Thingol died. The second thing that needs to happen is that Namo Mandos has to give an elf permission to leave, which he will only do if he feels that they've repented for anything that they did wrong. Now, how long this takes depends on how bad the elf was. The worse they are, the longer it's going to take them to repent. A comment is made regarding the elf Saros in the story that the Children of Húrin. His death was accidental, and he was certainly not evil, but he was a bully. He was a nasty sort of guy, and it was mentioned that he would be held in Mandos for a long time, not because, just being a bully is that bad, but because it would take him a long time to get to that point spiritually where he would admit that he was wrong and repent for what he did. So it had a lot to do with, how their demeanor is and their personality. And Thingol, he had some things to answer for. He wasn't exactly perfect. He had done some things that I would say are wrong. He was very arrogant at times, so he would have to humble himself before he got out of Mandos. And there isn't any reason to believe that it would be eternity or until the end of the world, at least. Melian, she could go there willingly, but even, Melian, who's a Maiar spirit, she would still need Namo's permission to leave. So she would only go to Mandos if she felt that either she would, they would get out after not a very long time, or she would just be fully confident that, Namo would let her come and go freely. She could just ask Namo, it's not like he's always in Mandos. She could just say, hey, could I go visit my husband, and then leave. And I think he would probably say yes, because Melian was always a positive influence on Thingol, and her presence there might hasten him repenting for the minor wrong things that he did in his life. So I don't think he would be in Mandos for very long. And that he and Melian could spend their time, the rest of the time on Earth, which is, until the world dies. They could be in Valinor, they could be in Eldamar, they could be in Erisea, they could, be anywhere in the Undying Lands that they wish to be. All right, let's move on to the next question. So this question came in from Walter White, who is one of my moderators on YouTube, who asks, how did Eöl the Dark Elf infuse his own malice into his sword Anglachel? Was it akin to the way that Sauron poured his own malice into the One Ring, along with other things, or was it some different way entirely? I would say that it's very different than what Sauron did. It's more akin to what elves actually did all the time. What Sauron did, the whole idea of him pouring malice, that really is a line, from the movie. He was putting power into the ring. That is to say, his very soul. And we talked about this recently. Sauron, he is an Ainu. He is all soul. They are power, just like the Valar. They're the same things as the Maiar. They're just more magnificent. Vala means power. So he poured himself into the One Ring, not to store his soul, but to empower the ring. Eöl, however, was just doing normal elvish craftsmanship. First, let's take a look at the passage that you're referring to, where Melian, whom we must not forget is an Ainu herself, states that there is malice in the blade. So I'm going to read you this paragraph from the Silmarillion. Then Beleg chose Anglachel, and that was a sword of great worth, and it was so named because it was made of iron that fell from heaven as a blazing star. It would cleave all earth-delved iron. One other sword only in Middle-earth was like to it. That sword does not enter into this tale, though it was made of the same ore by the same smith, and that smith was Eöl the Dark Elf, who took Arathel Turgon's sister to wife. He gave Anglachel to Thingol as fee, which he begrudged, for leave to dwell in Nan Elmoth. But its mate Anguirel he kept, until it was stolen from him by Meglin his son. But as Thingol turned the hilt of Anglachel toward Beleg, Melian looked at the blade, and she said, "There is malice in this sword. The dark heart of the smith still dwells in it. It will not love the hand it serves, neither will it abide with you long." So elvish smiths, they just put a bit of themselves into each and every craft that they make. It's not their soul, not literally, but their thoughts. Have you ever heard about food being made with love? Think of it like that, only instead of, like a pie, it's a sword. Of course, you don't usually make weapons with love. They're not implements of love, but you can love the act of creation. You can love what you do. The swords that are made in Gondolin, for example, were imbued with malice, the elvish malice towards orcs, which is why they, glow like a flame when the orcs are present. Eöl's malice is towards the Noldor, which is why Melian warns that the sword will not love the user. And it even is mentioned, that he doesn't really particularly like Thingol. He doesn't really like that he's having to give Thingol anything to live in the woods there. So, I wouldn't say he has open malice towards Thingol. He certainly tolerates him a lot better than he tolerates any of the Noldor. But Eöl just sort of hates everybody. He's just a nasty guy. So Eöl, presented Anglachel and its mate to Thingol, who himself was not a fan of the Feanorians. And of course, as mentioned, the mate doesn't come into the story. He wound up keeping that. But he really, Thingol himself, he's not a fan of the Feanorians. But that's because the kinslayings. He had no issues with the Noldor in general. He certainly had a fondness for Galadriel. Eöl, though, he had it in his heart that even the likes of Turgon was the bad guy. This is why Eöl refused to live in Gondolin. He had it in his head that everything that Morgoth was doing was actually the Noldor's fault, and that their mere presence had caused the wars in Beleriand. And I suppose there's sort of a twisted truth to it, but he's deluded if he thinks that Morgoth wouldn't bother the Sindar if he was left alone. Any elvish craft, or at least the really good ones, have the thoughts of the smith in them. And at this point, the thoughts of Eöl were not favorable towards a large chunk of elves. So even as he's presenting this sword to Thingol, ostensibly in friendship, as thanks for allowing him to live nearby, the sword was made with angst towards elves. Thankfully, this was not permanent. The sword did take to Beleg very well, and it mourned the accidental slaying of its master by Turin, and then Turin had it reforged and renamed it Gurthang. And Elvish legend even had it that the sword would eventually be used to kill Morgoth, So, yeah, he's not really doing something like the One Ring. For example, Beleg, he dies because he's accidentally killed by Turin. But of course, elves don't really die. He's just killed. So he goes to Mandos. Eventually, he's going to get a new body and everything. But the sword breaks at the end of the story, The Children of Húrin. So it's like destroyed at this point. And yeah, there's the elvish legend that it'll be restored at some point. But it's destroyed at this point. And that doesn't do anything to like weaken Beleg the way that destroying the One Ring would destroy a large portion of Sauron. So it's not quite like that. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Famita Karamani, and this is a question I've actually been hoping to get for a while. In The Lord of the Rings, in the scene where Denethor is eating and tells Pippin to sing, was the food he was eating a deliberate choice, like those tiny tomatoes looking like blood as he mashed them in his teeth? So this is the sort of thing that I hear all the time. Like everybody's, the tomato represents blood and violence and everything. And it's just one of those things that just sort of has the ring of truth to it. People go, that makes sense. That seems like something that Peter Jackson would have done. But it's actually not true. The food being red was not a deliberate choice. The intent was not to represent violence, but actually to represent corruption. So the use of tomato juice as blood to symbolize violence is it's like almost too obvious, I would say. And if we're being real, it probably would have been better to use wine to represent blood than a tomato. Rather, the scene was meant to represent how corrupt and disconnected Denethor is in this scene. Now, it's obligatory for me as a scholar of the books to point out the obvious. No, this didn't happen in the book. And while Denethor certainly had some issues in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, he wasn't anywhere near the monster that he was in Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings. So with that out there, this is a question about Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings, which is fine. So let's talk about the intent of the scene. So according to Peter Jackson, who talks about the scene in the director's commentary, he says that the idea that he had when he made this scene was that a normal person, when faced with violence, especially involving family members, like if you were told that your son was going out to war and it was pretty much hopeless and he was almost certainly going to die, you'd lose your appetite. You wouldn't really have the ability to eat, and if you were eating, you wouldn't enjoy eating. So to show that Denethor is so disconnected and so deranged, they made a scene where, knowing that Faramir will likely die, he's just shoveling food into his mouth and he's clearly enjoying it. Then let's go to Fran Walsh. Fran Walsh is Peter Jackson's wife, and she did a lot of the writing for the film. She contributed to the screenplay of all three of them, and in the same commentary she called Denethor's actions in this scene venal, meaning that he is a corrupted person. The purpose was essentially to make the audience uncomfortable, and not only is Denethor just sort of pigging out while his son is nearly dying, but he's enjoying it, and he's eating in a very messy fashion with all sorts of the words of Fran Walsh, cracking and spitting. The idea is it's not metaphorical. The tomato doesn't represent anything. It's merely just to show you what an uncouth, slob he's being. And this is exacerbated by the fact that he's making Pippin sing, and Pippin is in distress, and he's worried about Faramir, and Denethor is just sort of this callous person in the films, and he's seeing to his own comfort and his own entertainment while others suffer and die, and that's sort of what the idea of the scene. So they chose a tomato, I think, just because it's messy and he can just be gross, and you'd have all these food-eating sounds that are just going to kind of put you on edge and make your teeth itch a little bit. It wasn't specifically because it was red and represented blood. Like I said, if they wanted to do that, he'd probably just have, like, you know, just be drinking wine, red wine, and have it running down his face. That would probably be the... You know, and then it would get on his hands, and it would be the classic blood on his hands sort of thing, you know. And they might even do then a little bit of Macbeth where he's trying to scrub it off his hands, but the spot won't go away, like what happened with Lady Macbeth. So, you know, they could have gone that route, but that's not what they were doing. They were really just trying to make you uncomfortable, and it really worked. It really worked. Nobody really enjoys watching the tomato scene. I mean, we enjoy Pippin singing and how well done the scene is, but it's uncomfortable to watch. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Brian Perkins, who asks, why did Gothmog assume military command at Pelennor Field when the Witch King was dispatched? Why not one of the other Nazgul? So if you notice, the Nazgul, they tend to go into like a blind panic when things don't go their way, and Gothmog's title actually tells us the rest of the story here. The Nazgul, they don't really do well when they're losing. They just kind of fall apart when things turn against them, with the exception of the Witch King. When Elrond and Gandalf sent the flood, that immediately swept 3 of them away. And one of those 3 was definitely the Witch King, because he was nearly across the ford when the flood came. The other 6 were forced into the river by Glorfindel and Aragorn and Merry and Pippin, and because they were waving flaming branches. Their leader is swept away. 6 of Sauron's most feared servants panic and run into the danger rather than fight. So what happens after is even wilder. All but one of the horses is killed by the flood. And all of these wraiths, they've lost their mantles. The only one who didn't panic and just start wandering around blindly was the Witch King. So he makes his way all the way down to Mordor on the one surviving horse. He gets juiced up by Sauron. The phrase that Tolkien used was he was given additional demonic force. And then he had to travel all the way back to Eriador to rescue the other 8, and they were scattered, so that probably took a while. They just don't do well without him, is what I'm saying. So with the Witch King not only being gone, but absolutely just killed at Pelennor Fields, he's done, he's dead. There needed to be somebody present who just had a bit more of a head on their shoulders to direct the rest, and that was Gothmog. Now, we don't really know much about Gothmog other than the name. We don't even know what he is. He is surely named after Gothmog, Lord of the Balrogs, who was killed in Gondolin by Ecthelion, but he's not a Balrog. The films portrayed him as an orc, a very devious and cunning orc, but Tolkien was actually unspecific. We don't know what Gothmog was. Personally, I think he was a man. I think he was likely a black Númenorian who had joined Sauron, much like the mouth of Sauron. The fact that Gothmog it has a title which he's referred to as the Lieutenant of Morgul, it says a lot. The word lieutenant, and we talked about this not super long ago, but lieutenant has a few meanings, but the way that Tolkien uses it, and he surely would have pronounced it lieutenant, just to stick it to the French, like any proper Englishman would, there's an old meaning of the word that basically means second in command. So if Gothmog is the Lieutenant of Morgul, we know that Minas Morgul is where the army issued out of, and we know that because Sam and Frodo and Gollum saw them leaving, and the Witch King almost caught them. We can safely say that the Witch King is in charge of Minas Morgul, and that Gothmog is his lieutenant, the second in command. So evil armies just tend to fall apart when their leader is taken out, and we saw that happen in The Hobbit, for example, when Bolg died, and the goblins and the wargs just kind of went into a spiral at that point. Sauron is craftier than most, so having someone there that's ready to take over the logistics and the strategy, especially that he wasn't actually at Pelennor Fields. He was stationed in Osgiliath and relaying orders. That was just a smart move. Of course, I mean, they still lost. Mordor still lost, but we don't even know what happened to Gothmog. He probably retreated into Mordor at that point. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Oh, actually, before we do that, I wanted to highlight one of the comments here having to do with the meaning of lieutenant. I said it means second in command, and Michael Price, I didn't want to go into the linguistics too much, but Michael Price decided that he wanted to because he got curious and he looked into it. And lieu means place, as in proxy, say in lieu of something, and tenant is holder, so place holder, so basically a deputy. So and then he says that the British, this is very interesting, this is the part I didn't know. I knew that first part, but I didn't know the second part. So the British pronunciation lieutenant is, of course, to irritate French people, but the joke might actually be on the Brits because lef might be based on an old French Louvre, which has the same meaning, place. So they're still saying it a French way, just a more archaic way. So I don't study French like many languages. That's not one that I'm super familiar with, but there you have it. All right, now let's move on to the next question. Our next question is one of those anonymous follow-up questions. We don't know what it's a follow-up to or who wrote it, but here we are. Why would a powerful spirit like a Balrog not be intimidated by Gandalf, even if he claimed to be a servant of the secret fire, wielding the flame of Anor? So Gandalf and the Balrog were essentially equals, something that Gandalf had already stated before he made his speech, but that doesn't mean that the Balrog was not intimidated. As a matter of fact, I'm going to present the case that the Balrog was intimidated by Gandalf. So, one thing that many people forget when they're studying this scene in which Gandalf clashes with the Balrog known as Durin's Bane on the Bridge of Khazad-dûm, from the chapter called The Bridge of Khazad-dûm, is that it is not their first clash. And Gandalf has already acknowledged that the creature was an equal to his own force. Before they had even seen each other, Gandalf could tell there's something greater driving the orcs before it, and attempted to bar the way behind him while fleeing from Balin's tomb by using magic to close a door. The counterspell was so terrible that it caused an explosion which buried the Balrogs under rubble and sent Gandalf flying and tumbling down a very long flight of steps. Both survived, but Gandalf stated quite plainly that the event nearly killed him. I'm going to read that section here. Suddenly at the top of the stair there was a stab of white light. Then there was a dull rumble and a heavy thud. The drum beats broke out wildly, doom, boom, doom, boom, and then stopped. Gandalf came flying down the steps and fell to the ground in the midst of the company. Well, well, that's over, said the wizard, struggling to his feet. I have done all that I could, but I have met my match and have nearly been destroyed. But don't stand there, go on. You will have to do without light for a while. I am rather shaken. Go on, go on. Where are you, Gimli? Come ahead with me. Keep close behind, all of you. A bit later, Gandalf describes the ordeal in more detail, so I'm going to skip ahead to that section here. I do not know, answered Gandalf, but I found myself suddenly faced by something that I have not met before. I could think of nothing to do but to try to put a shutting spell on the door. I know many, but to do things of that kind rightly requires time, and even then the door can be broken by strength. As I stood there I can hear orc voices on the other side. At any moment I thought they would burst it open. I could not hear what was said. They seemed to be talking in their own hideous tongue. All I caught was gosh, that is, fire. Then something came into the chamber. I felt it through the door, and the orcs themselves were afraid and fell silent. It laid hold of the iron ring, and then it perceived me and my spell. What it was I cannot guess, but I have never felt such a challenge. The counterspell was terrible. It nearly broke me. For an instant the door left my control and began to open. I had to speak a word of command. That proved too great a strain. The door burst into pieces. Something dark as a cloud was blocking out all the light inside, and I was thrown backward down the stairs. All the wall gave way, and the roof of the chamber as well, I think. So, Remembering this part and Gandalf's explanation and how shaken he is explains a lot about their later clash. Note that Gandalf did not attempt to blast the Balrog with magic when they met on the bridge, and the Balrog did not attempt to do the same to Gandalf. Gandalf used words, and then he attempted to avoid the fight by dropping the Balrog into the pit by breaking the bridge with his staff, which destroyed his staff. And when he was dragged down, he used his sword to fight the creature. The fact is, when it comes to using magic, they are evenly matched, and Tolkien made it clear here that when magic clashes in equal measure, the result is a violent explosion. So Gandalf describes the then unknown creature as his match, and this is coupled with the fact that the Balrog uses his whip and his sword rather than magic in their second clash, leads to the very strong assumption that Durin's Bane may have been just as shaken by the first clash as Gandalf was. The words that Gandalf used were intimidating. There's no doubt about that in my mind. Gandalf called himself a servant of the secret fire, which indicates he is one of the Ainur and specifically aligned with Iluvatar, not Melkor, as the Balrog is. This is Gandalf's way of saying, I'm from the same order as you, and I am your enemy. He brags about the flame of Anar, the flame of the sun, which is stating that as the Balrog is a creature of the flame, so is Gandalf, but that his fire is greater, and that it's holy fire. The dark fire will not avail you is Gandalf's way of saying that unholy fire cannot harm him. Now, the Balrog does not step back or submit, though it was momentarily stopped in its tracks when Boromir blew his horn, but it did react. And the way that it reacted is very telling. Its fire dimmed and its shadow grew. The Balrog understood that the usual trick of just blazing into fire was not going to impress Gandalf very much, so it dimmed its fire and tried darkness instead. The issue is, just being intimidated doesn't mean that you just give up. There's the fight or flight, which is really fight, flight, or freeze response that people have, and I would be willing to bet that the Ainur have this as well in these situations, especially incarnates like Gandalf and like Durin's Bane. So in this case, it chose to fight. And you might ask, well, why didn't it flee? And that's actually really simple. The Balrog is essentially a refugee of the War of Wrath, and his side lost. Durin's Bane likely used the tunnels deep under Angband to travel far away once the war was lost, and he had been, not been outside since the end of that war at the end of the First Age. This means that throughout the entirety of the Second Age and Third Age, and we're at, the end of the Third Age here, it has not seen the light of day or the stars in the sky. When it was discovered by dwarves, it ended their whole civilization and has remained vigilant since then. It didn't go back to sleep. It had to know that it didn't get every single dwarf, that there were survivors, there were refugees, many of them had escaped, and Dain the Second Ironfoot saw the Balrog. He didn't know what he was seeing, but he saw the Balrog, and we can reason that the Balrog saw Dain. So for all Durin's Bane knows, the surface could still be crawling with high elves and Maiar and other agents of the Valar. It could just still be under occupation, considering that not a very long time ago, by Maya standards, after he is seen by a dwarf through the Dimrill Gate, suddenly this wizard shows up, and this all but confirms his fears that he is still hunted. I mean, this guy shows up and it's like, hey, I work for Iluvatar. Choosing to fight likely seemed like the prudent choice, hoping to put an end to Gandalf. The fact that Gandalf was actually trying to leave rather than fight, that was probably what caused the Balrog to feel even more fear, because for all he knows, Gandalf's going to run and grab Eanwa, and that's a fight he really doesn't want. He doesn't want to deal with somebody like Eanwa or Tulkas or somebody. But so anyway, there you have it. I would say that's my case for the fact that the Balrog was in fact intimidated, but just because you're intimidated doesn't mean you don't fight. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Brad Dickerson, who asks, why is music and singing so powerful and important in Tolkien's work? In the case of Tolkien's Legendarium, music and singing is incredibly important because it is the literal fabric of reality. In forming a creation myth for his world, Tolkien chose music as the method by which the world was created. Rather than just saying, well, God made the world and it was good, he goes into a little bit more detail. God in this case is called Eru, which means the One, or Iluvatar, which means All-Father. First he created the Ainur, which means Holy Ones, and they're meant to be understood to be angels. God taught the angels music, and then they played for him in singles and in small groups. But when he gathered all of the Ainur together for a big performance, he gave them themes, of which there were 3. And they played music, and he listened to them. And they played the music based on his themes and improvised from his themes. And this process was called the Ainulindala, or music of the Holy Ones. One of the angels, Melkor, who we could understand to be Satan, did not follow the themes. He sang music that was discordant to the themes of Iluvatar, and he created discord and conflict and evil. Iluvatar created the world based on the music that was played. He didn't censor any of the voices that he heard, not even Melkor. When he showed them a vision of creation, he simply stated, "Behold your music." The very fabric of reality is made out of music, which is why music, and especially singing, because the angels don't actually play instruments, their voices just sound like instruments, it is the most potent form of magic in the world. And as a matter of fact, all magic is more potent when it uses a voice. In the previous question, we had that section from Gandalf, who was trying to use a spell, but then he said, I had to issue a word of command. That's like the most powerful magic that he could use. And if you look at that section in the book, command is capitalized, so that's important. It's not just a word of command, it's a word of command. But anyway, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Randy Ham, who asks, on their first pass through Lothlorien, Galadriel showed Sam the vision of the Shire. Was what she showed already happening, or was it a warning of what was to come? I would say it was already happening, though the particular vision might have been, a little bit down the line. I'll explain. Towards the end of the Return of the King, Gandalf goes looking for Saruman at Orthanc, and he finds that he's gone. Treebeard states that he let the wizard go, stating that he figured Saruman was now harmless. He was wrong, of course, Gandalf pointed out later on, but Gandalf did not hold this against Treebeard because it wasn't in his nature to be a jailer. The date that Saruman was released from Orthanc by Treebeard is, in the Third Age, 3019, August the 15th. On August the 28th, the company runs into Saruman and Grima the Wormtongue in Dunland, and they were claiming to be looking for a way out of Aragorn's realm. Appendix B states that he reached the Shire on August 22nd, and that he was killed by Grima on November the 3rd. Suffice it to say that just under 3 months, there is not really enough time to do the sort of damage that the hobbits saw when they returned home, and especially as they are told that issues in the Shire had started up, not with Saruman, but with Lothar Sackville Baggins buying up farmland and causing a famine. And of course, Saruman was still kind of behind that anyway. He had been at work in the north for some time, as explained, that a lot of the crooks in Bree that troubled Frodo at the start of his story were Saruman's men, and some of them had orc blood in their veins, making them likely related to the Uruk-hai that Saruman had bred. Unfinished Tales tells us that Saruman's meddling in the Shire happened even earlier than Frodo leaving it, as he traveled there in the past in disguise, mistaken by some hobbits for Gandalf, which incidentally is why Gandalf's reputation took such a dive in the Shire. Merry and Pippin also find pipeweed in his storerooms, and they wonder, well, how did he get that? And they marvel at the fact that when he spoke to him in Dunland, he alluded to having bought the weed. So Saruman had been meddling in the affairs of the Shire for quite some time, creating a trade route for pipeweed through Dunland down to Isengard and hiring rough men in the Breeland area to be his spies. Saruman was in the process of doing to the Shire what he had done to Isengard, and Sam was getting a glimpse of it. Now, that specific vision of Hamfast being put out of his home, something that, it was already happening, or was it going to happen? We don't exactly know, but Galadriel's mirror isn't even the first bit of forewarning that Sam got. Sam remembers at this point that Elrond had wanted to send Merry and Pippin back to the Shire, and he stated, hey, there's something to that. Mr. Merry might have been able to prevent this from happening. He would have sorted this out. So we don't know if the actual vision, that specific scene, was something that was going on right at that moment, or if it was something that was going to happen real soon, or something that might have already happened. Galadriel stated all three of these were possible, but the root of the issue, though, the ruination of the Shire, had already begun before Frodo had even left. All right, let's move on to the last question. Our final question comes in by the request of Link of Wise, who asks, it has been said that Morgoth infused his evil into Middle-earth itself. Couldn't one of the other Valar do the same to counteract this, like infuse their goodness into it, even if it came at the cost of their own power in a similar way? There's really two reasons why that wouldn't work. The first is that doing that might actually be incredibly destructive, and the other is that it wouldn't work, really. It wouldn't be enough. Both reasons are really, sort of folded into the same idea. Let's talk about the War of the Valar, also known as the Battle of the Powers. This was the first conflict in Middle-earth, and by far its most destructive. The Valar they're not just powerful, they are power. I talked about this a little while ago. The very word Valar means the powers. The conflict was not evenly distributed. The Valar didn't split in half and then all fight each other. It was 14 against 1. All of the rest of them fighting Melkor. And they only barely won. This is to say that even with the powers of all 14 Valar combined, they're only just enough to defeat Melkor. Now, I know what you might say. Melkor reduced himself. And this is true and it isn't true at the same time. What he did was not so much become less powerful, but he spread his power out too thin. He allowed a lot of his power to pass into Middle-earth, the same way that Sauron later allowed the greater part of his power to pass into the One Ring. Hence, Middle-earth is Morgoth's ring. With this in mind, all of Morgoth's power still exists because Middle-earth was not destroyed in the way that the One Ring was. So, though there was not a great deal of power left in his frame, all of his power still existed within the circles of the world throughout the First Age. So if the Valar decided to match power with power by letting their power pass into the world, they would be faced with some very big issues. The first is that Morgoth cannot be purified. The power in the earth is Morgoth, and he can't just be made not evil against his consent. He has to choose redemption. So attempting to forcibly purify him would be, first of all, it would be morally wrong, but it would be an act of war that his shadow would fight against. Because Tolkien stated that this shadow of Morgoth that's in the earth retained some of his wisdom and his thoughts even after he was gone. Not only that, but he cannot be exorcised from the earth any more than Sauron could be exorcised from the ring. Otherwise, that would have been a lot easier to do instead of going all the way to Mount Doom. So suffice it to say, it just doesn't work that way. But let's say it did, right? Let's say that's possible. And that brings us back to the whole idea of the levels of power that are involved here. And I don't like to have too much discussion about power levels, but the Valar would be weakening themselves to match his power, and it may just not be enough. Even if all 14 of them poured most of their power into the world, it would, just to put it simply, it would be a grand and fruitless venture. It just might not even be enough, even if it did work that way, which it really doesn't. Anyway, that was our last question. So let's go to the quiz results. So this is our first full week of quizzes, and so we have seven quizzes. I've been posting one every day, and if you haven't been seeing them, well, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. You should be coming through. If you have alerts on, you should get alerts when I post a new quiz. It's been every day. You can see them on the community section. So we have 7 of them to go over, and here's the first one that I asked, which is, not the first one I asked, but the first one we're going to talk about is, who forged Narsil, the Sword of Elendil? And as you can see, more than half of you guys got this right. The answers that I submitted were Telchar, Celebrimbor, Eol, and Durin. I wanted to make sure that there were 4 smiths here. Telchar is actually the correct answer. He was a dwarf from the First Age. Aragorn actually mentions Telchar in the Two Towers when he speaks about his sword. Celebrimbor, he didn't really make very many weapons. He made some of the Rings of Power. Eol, of course, he made some weapons. We talked about them earlier, like Anglachal and Anguirel. And Durin, all the dwarves were great craftsmen, but Durin did not make that. I'm surprised that anybody voted for chose Durin as the answer, but there you have it. And I got a comment on this from someone, man, I thought it was Elrond. Elrond might have been involved in the reforging of Narsil when it became Andúril, but he was not involved in the original forging. Moving on to the next one, who took in Frodo Baggins after his parents died? And I knew this one was going to be rough because this is sort of a trick question because everybody's mind immediately goes to Bilbo Baggins, and you can see that 75% here, and I'm saying that as I see it now. When I edit this, it might have changed a little bit, but 75% of people said Bilbo Baggins. The actual correct answer is Rorimak Brandybuck. See, Frodo's parents died when he was only 2 years old. They died in a boating accident. No, Gollum was not involved. They died in a boating accident. They drowned, and Rorimak Brandybuck took in the very young Frodo Baggins, who was 2 years old, and he lived with Rorimak for 10 years until he was 12, and that's when he came to live with Bilbo. So yes, he did live with Bilbo from the age of 12 until the age of 33, when he inherited Bag End because Bilbo was leaving, retiring essentially from life in the Shire. The first person to take in Frodo after his parents' death was actually Rorimak Brandybuck. Our next question here, which of the following never spoke in any of Tolkien's stories? This was a fun one because I just thought of the scene where Legolas claims that the rocks that were used to build Hallan, Regin, Celebrimbor's realm, spoke to him and spoke about how the elves had left Hallan. And it's sort of an unusual thing, and Tolkien has a lot of unusual things that speak. Most of you guys got this right. There's no talking fish. 59% here got that right. No talking fish in any... I mean, there's mermaids, but that's not really the same thing. There are, of course, birds that talk in The Hobbit, and some of the wizards... Notably, Radagast can speak to birds, and he teaches that skill to Saruman. A sword. We talked about Anglachel earlier and how it was reforged into Gurthang and how it had a little bit of Eol's thoughts in it, and it actually speaks to Turin before he dies, so there's that as well. But no speaking fish. Here's our next one. Which of the following is not the name of one of the wizards? I knew this was going to be a tough one, but I have to say it was close, but... As you can see, the plurality here at 37%, Heramor is not the name of one of the wizards. Let's go down the list. Palasendo is another name for Alatar. He's one of the blue wizards. Then there's... actually, no, not Alatar. The other one, Palando. Palando, he's also known as Palasendo. And he also had another name, which was... Romastano. So those are the 3 names we know of that particular blue wizard. The other one was Alatar, who was also known as, Morenatar, and then he had another name, which is escaping my thoughts at the moment. I'll probably put it on the screen there. And then Hravendil is an old name for Radagast. And Tarandor is an old name for Saruman the White. Heramor was actually a man. He was a sorcerer, though. He was a Númenorian who joined Sauron and became a sorcerer. And then he later became a lord of the Haradrim in Middle-earth. So I thought it was a name that, he was a sorcerer, and it did sound kind of like a wizard name. So there you have it. But you guys did pretty good on that one. Here's the next one. What was the surname that Tolkien preferred for Samwise, later changing it to Gamgee? Now, a lot of you guys went for Gardner, and I thought there's no way you guys would go for Gardner. That one's too, because what happened was actually in the generation after Sam, his children, they don't keep the name Gamgee. They became the Gardner family, sort of in honor of their father, who was a humble gardener, and became the mayor of the Shire, and this wonderful, really important guy who wound up sailing to the west and had 13 children, and a lot of them were pretty important and had these major connections all over the Shire. I was asking for what was the original name that Tolkien wanted to call Sam and didn't. And it was actually Goodchild, which 21% of you got. More people went for Gardner and Gaffer than Goodchild. This is actually something from Tolkien's letters. It was a letter to his son Christopher, where he said that he would have preferred the name Sam Goodchild, but he felt that if he used that name in the book, then his son Christopher would be against that and would tell him that it doesn't work, and he would never hear the end of it. Gaffer is sort of old-timey slang for granddad, and that's what or just old man, really, and that's what most people in the Shire call Sam's father. Hamfast, he's known as the Gaffer, and then Graham is just a name that's sort of this English sounding name that I just put in there that 5% of people went for. But yeah, it was Goodchild. Here's the next one. Which of the following is not one of Aragorn's direct ancestors? And this was a fun one because I posted this, and then I just stepped away from him, and then I came back, and I was really only gone for a moment, and then I refreshed it, and I saw that there were exactly 4 votes, and it was evenly split. It was 25% down the line, and I go, this is going to be interesting. As you can see here, the plurality here went for Finwë, and that's not the case. Finwë is a direct descendant of Aragorn. Finwë was the father of Fingolfin, who was the father of King Turgon of Gondolin, and then Turgon had a daughter, and that daughter married Tur, and their son was Eärendil, and then from there you get Elrond and Elros. Elros was the first king of Númenor, and then it goes straight down to Aragorn. So, he is a direct descendant. Melian is a direct descendant because, of course, she married Ilu Thingol, and then their daughter was Luthien, and then Luthien has a son named Dior, and Dior had a daughter named Elwing, who married Eärendil, and then Elros was their son, the first king of Númenor, and so on and so on and so on. Speaking of Melian's daughter Luthien, her husband was named Beren, and Beren's father was named Barahir. Most people didn't go for Barahir. I think either they've read Beren and Luthien and they remembered it, or they just remembered that the ring that Aragorn had in his youth was called the Ring of Barahir. It was the ring that he gave to Arwen when he pledged his love for her. Hurin Thallion is related to Aragorn in the way that his brother Hur was the father of Tur, and we talked about Tur marrying the princess of Gondolin. Her name escapes me. It was either Idris or Indis. I'll probably put it on the screen. I always confuse those two names, sort of like Orodreth and Ondafer, and sometimes Fingon and Finrod. That's more Laurel's one, but sometimes I get those two mixed up as well. But anyway, so his brother was a direct descendant. So it's sort of like he's related to him, but he's not a direct ancestor. Sort of like Elrond is not Aragorn's direct ancestor. He's sort of like an uncle from a lot of generations ago, about 60 generations back. And then we move on. So, yeah, like as you could see. So, I mean, the correct answer was in second place. It's not too terrible. It's pretty good. And here we have it. And here's the last one, which is what was Tolkien's preferred or proposed reason that Gandalf could not read the runes in Glamdring, on Glamdring and Orcrist, and had to have them, I'm sorry. I'm just tired. He had to have Elrond read the runes from it. And this is a question that comes up quite a lot, where people say, well, how come Gandalf couldn't have read those runes? And the easy sort of answer is because Gandalf was just a wizard at this point, and he wasn't necessarily, like the character that he would become later. But Tolkien did have a reason, and I gave 3 reasons here, one of which is Tolkien's reason. And this is pretty evenly split in almost a three-way tie. You can see that it's a 2-way tie here between the correct answer and an incorrect answer, which were that the runes were just in a dialect that Gandalf was unfamiliar with. 30% of people went for that. 28% of people went for that he just didn't have the time, which is, it's believable that he just didn't have the time to translate the runes. And of course, only 12% people went for the fact that when Gandalf became incarnate, he lost a lot of his memories, so he couldn't remember how to read Gondolin runes. And it is true that he has limited memories of the past, but no reason that he couldn't read Gondolin runes. So the correct answer, which I said it's pretty evenly split here, was that the swords had been, plundered and plundered again. They were very dirty, and they had layers of dirt and especially dried blood covering them, and they had to be professionally cleaned by Elrond, and then Elrond cleaned the swords, and then the runes become visible. And if you're wondering, well, where does this come from? Is it something from one of his letters, or what is the deal with this? Where does this come from? This actually comes from the idea that Tolkien had to rewrite The Hobbit completely, from scratch, and republish it, just like kind of a third version, because there was the original first edition where Gollum was different, and then there was the revised edition, which is what most people have. As a matter of fact, if I grab my copy of The Hobbit, as old as it is, at some point, I don't know if it's on the spine or if it's inside here or whatnot, but it'll say revised. Or maybe this one doesn't. I know the other one, the little mass market paperback that I have, says revised at one point. I don't know where it's... Maybe this one doesn't say it, but it is absolutely the revised version. The little mass market paperback that I have, I think I gave it to my grandmother, actually. But that one definitely says revised edition. But anyway, there was so that's sort of the second edition. He was going to do like a third one that was going to be completely rewritten to be more in line with the Lord of the Rings and with the Silmarillion, and a lot of the things that Bilbo just made up wouldn't be there, and it would basically be kind of the story as Gandalf would tell it, instead of the story as Bilbo would have told it. And then he was talked out of it. His friends told him, don't do it. It would be a shame, because The Hobbit is a wonderful story the way it is, and people love it, and you're going to turn it into something that it's not. And he said, you know what? You're right. When you're right, you're right. Anyway, that was the last quiz. Like I said, posting these quizzes every day. They are just for fun. And please, when you leave a comment, and leave comments on these quizzes if you want to, tell me if you got it right, tell me if you got it wrong, tell me if you think it was hard or easy or whatever. Just make sure you don't post anything that might give away the answer. So, and people have been pretty good about this. Like, I've been getting comments like, oh, dang, I lost my streak, you got me there, or hey, I got this one, or hey, I didn't get this one, or oh, this one's interesting, or I like the quizzes. I've been getting comments like that, and those are great. But like I said, just try not to leave any kind of comments that might give away the answer, because that kind of takes the fun out of it. Anyway, guys, we've reached the end of the video, and I've had a blast. So I will ask you at this point, please subscribe if you haven't already. Subscribe to the channel. Consider membership. Membership really helps me out. And I've had people ask me, how do I become a member? There's a little button that says join. You click that, and it does cost money, but it is very cheap. I've set it at $5 a month, which is almost nothing, but it gets you some great perks, including seeing all the videos early, having a cool badge that displays if you show up to live streams and or if you leave comments, and you get some access to some emotes that you could use in live stream chat, or you could use it in comments if you want. I need to make more of those, I think. I made a few. There's like a Silmaril, there's the Eye of Sauron, and there's like a ring, the one ring. I should probably make some more. I just have to come up with some ideas of little things that I can draw and make them. And I did draw those, by the way, so if they're not perfect, it says, well, I'm not that great of an artist, but I'm rather proud of the Silmaril, though. But anyway, consider it. And then I've had people say, well, sometimes I hit the join button and it doesn't work. It doesn't actually do anything, and that's like a glitch at YouTube. So if you look at the description of this video or any video that I've put out, the very first thing, it should say join the channel as a member, and there's a link, and you could try that, because I've had some people who send me messages like, hey, I want to join the channel as a member, but the join button doesn't actually do anything. And the first time I heard that, I go, well, that's not great. So I said, let me try something, and I came up with a link, and I put it there, and I said, did that work? And then the person said, yeah, that worked. So that I can confirm that works. Anyway, we'll see you guys next time. Send me some questions, leave me a comment, like the video, share and subscribe, join if you want. I'll see you next time.